minorities to vote. Dozens of demonstrators gathered over the weekend to protest the changes. Voting rights advocates argue the controversial law could have broader political implications for the future election cycles, going as far as likening it to the Jim Crow era restrictions. So for more on this, let's bring in CBS News senior White House and political correspondent Ed O'Keefe. Good morning, Ed.
Good morning, Anne Marie. As you mentioned, those laws in Georgia are earning the attention of the president, who calls them, quote, an atrocity, and says that the Justice Department will be looking into them. The changes include stricter ID requirements for absentee voting, limiting the use of ballot drop boxes, and making it a crime for outside groups to offer food and water to people standing in line. But it will also expand early voting statewide. In the wake of recent mass shootings, Mr. Biden said Sunday he's also willing to work with Republicans on gun rights if they're open to, quote, rational proposals like expanding the gun background check system. Democratic and Republican senators said over the weekend there might be a way to make that happen. An optimistic Mr. Biden told reporters on his way back from Delaware last night that he already passed gun reform before as a senator and, quote, it's going to happen again. But the president's big focus this week is set to be on infrastructure. On Wednesday in Pittsburgh, he's set to begin laying out plans for repairing the nation's aging roads, bridges, airports, train stations, and rail lines, and expanding broadband internet access. Next month, aides say he'll focus on expanding human infrastructure, or trying to enact a series of Democratic Party proposals like expanding pre-K to schools across the country, possibly providing free community college to eligible low-income Americans, and subsidizing child care payments for working parents. Anne Marie?
Ed, I want to take it back to this election legislation that was passed in Georgia. You know, typically elections are the domain of states. So what, if anything, can the White House do in the case of this law in Georgia?
That's right. They're the domain of states, but the Voting Rights Act does apply in some instances, although it's a far more narrow law than it used to be. And it's unclear what exactly the Justice Department will be able to do. Spokespeople over the weekend saying they're aware of the law, they're looking into it, but it's unclear whether there would be some kind of a lawsuit filed or some other attempt to encourage Georgia to make some changes. And this is ongoing across the country, so whatever the Justice Department may see in Georgia could potentially affect the debate in other states.
Speaking of that, you're right. There are a number of states, particularly states that have, you know, Republican-controlled legislatures that are really pushing a number of proposals that would limit access to voting. How close are any of these states to sort of pushing these proposals into law?
Given that they are Republican proposals and you've got a series of big states with Republican governors and Republican legislatures, some of these changes are probably inevitable. Look at Arizona, Florida, and Texas especially, where you are seeing debate continuing in their state legislatures to make similar changes. Stricter ID requirements on absentee ballots, limiting the number of early voting days and the hours in which voting can be held early. Other proposals looking at those drop boxes, for example. In the case of the ID requirement, in Georgia at least, and this is what's also up for consideration in other states, what it would do instead of requiring you to sign the ballot, because remember there have been so many questions about signature verification and all the potential for fraud there, as some allege, although there's never been widespread examples of this. They say instead of that, you'd have to potentially put down your driver's license or part of your Social Security number to serve as an ID on your ballot. Some would argue, including our own David Becker, our elections law expert that we talk to frequently about this, that isn't necessarily a bad idea because it's a more uniform form of identification. The problem, critics argue, is that there are voters out there who may not have a driver's license, probably have a Social Security number, but if there are other forms of ID that are available, maybe if they don't rent or they don't own their property, it might be difficult for them to, for example, provide a utility bill if that was some kind of a potential form of ID. So all of this to be hashed out by states in the coming weeks, but a total of 43 across the country were looking at proposals that would have changed the way people voted last November.
Listen, before we let you go, you mentioned the president's infrastructure plan. Infrastructure is usually an easy one for an administration because both Republicans and Democrats seem to find it a good thing to spend money on, right? Roads and bridges, you can't go wrong. But I'm not sure about the Biden's plan. What's in it? What can we expect to hear from him?
Yeah, in theory, everyone loves the idea of spending more money on it. The question is how you pay for it. And that's going to be the big sticking point here in Washington as Democrats and Republicans get down to this. Democrats believing to be focused on raising the corporate tax rate, possibly raising taxes on wealthier Americans. There are Republicans and even some moderate Democrats, though, who are concerned about how that could affect Americans across the country or just don't like the idea of a tax increase. What this is likely to include is trillions. We're talking with a T now, to spend on updating roads, bridges, rail tunnels, like the tunnels there in New York that take the rail lines under the Hudson River into New York City and over to New Jersey, updating train stations, airports across the country, expanding broadband internet access to far-flung rural parts of this country. That's a huge priority for lawmakers from rural communities across the country who say, you know, their communities have been hamstrung by this pandemic if you're trying to work from home or learn from home when you don't have reliable internet access. What will be more interesting to watch for in April, though, Anne-Marie, is this idea of human infrastructure. That proposal, which really will be a series of Democratic Party priorities, like, again, expanding pre-K, which is something that's popular and available in many urban areas and in some states, but certainly is not an option nationwide. Possibly helping to pay for child care, which there's a big belief, especially after this pandemic, that the gap there for working families who can't afford to put the kids in child care and also work could be a big issue. And then there may be some other changes related to health care, even climate change. In fact, in the proposal he's going to unveil on Wednesday, it's likely there'll be a big discussion about somehow spending money to mitigate against natural disasters, making sure roads and bridges, for example, are retrofit against hurricanes or tornadoes and other big weather events. That is another area where there could be some disagreement. Do you really want to be spending money on something that some Republicans still don't believe is necessarily a big problem?
Yeah, climate preparedness. I don't think we can deny it anymore. We spend so much of our time covering natural disasters right here at home. Whatever you think the reason is, there's an issue that needs to be tackled. Ed, thank you very much.